All right, guys. Are you bored in the house and in the house bored? Yes, me too. So, Crim 1, let's knock out Chapter 12 about jails and prisons. Obviously, I'm a corrections girl, so these are things that are kind of right up my alley. Incarceration, formal sanction for criminal behavior. That's when someone is confined against their will for whatever purpose. Jails. We did talk about this at the very beginning because I think I told you it's one of my pet peeves, jails and prisons. Jails are local facilities that are run by typically your local sheriff's department, and they house people who are either pending trial or they've been sentenced to something other than prison. There's a whole bunch of people in jail. Different types of people. Different types of, there you go. Pretrial individuals serving short-term mentally disturbed persons awaiting transfer to psychiatric facilities. We all know the Fresno County Jail is downtown in Fresno. The jail is very full typically. So we see one of the problems there being overcrowding. We've also had some issues more recently in California with AB 109, a lot of people who would have been housed in prison are now being housed in jails. And as you probably are aware, typically a person doesn't spend more than... Let me back that up. Jails were not designed for people to spend long periods of time there. And I'm talking about years there, and it's happening that way now. So anyways, that's what the jails are. Race of jail inmates in 2014. This is nationwide. 47% white, 35 Black or African American, 15 Latino, and 3 others. Any surprises here? Yeah, I don't know. Prisons. These are typically they're state-run facilities where people are serving more than a year. The federal government also runs a prison system, so there are state and federal prisons. But typically, again, when you're talking about your jail, you're talking about a local facility, and prisons are going to be either state or federal facilities. Okay. All right. Wow, prison population. Our population in prison has been going down probably since 2014. And California's had a big impact on that because of AB 109. Again, we released a bunch of prisoners because basically the Supreme Court told us we had to, or California would lose control of our own prison systems. There's different types of security prisons, of course. If you're a low-level offender, you're probably going to be in a medium or low security. High-level offenders are going to be in a more high security. Supermax, you're kind of talking about death row type places, maximum security. Again, kind of, this is all a lot of that common sense stuff. The more difficult you are to supervise, the less freedom you have. So those guys in the Supermax facilities are probably not getting out of their cells very often, as opposed to someone who's in a low-level facility. They probably have a decent amount of freedom within the facility. I don't mean like they're going outside, but within the facility. This is a picture of a minimum security prison. This looks like I don't know, like a little campground or something. Prisoners are classified in order to keep the facility safe. So when they are booked or brought into the prison, someone will determine where the best place would be to house that particular person. Now, this could have, in California, our big issue is gang activity. So which gangs are you involved with? You're not going to put someone who is at risk of being killed by another gang with that gang, because nobody wants to deal with the increased level of violence. So also you got to consider things like, is someone a sex offender? Sex offenders are often targets of other inmates. They also call them chomos, by the way. That's kind of a side note. But chomos are known as the lowest of the low in the prison system. So they typically need to be protected. So classification, this is when the prison system figures out where everybody should go. Risk classification, already talked about that. Correctional staff, work stress, danger, constant. That's really all you need to know. think about, I mean, just in general, how stressful it would be to be a correctional officer. And I'm recording this during the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. Imagine what it's like working in the prisons now. People, prisoners have the coronavirus in California. And there was a woman correctional officer, it wasn't in California, but somewhere in the United States, who actually died from the coronavirus. So, I mean, these are things that you got to consider also when you're talking about correctional staff. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, a lot of, what does it take to be a correctional officer? Well, typically not that much. Some places will require a certain number of college units. Some just require a high school diploma. Fresno County Jail is now, it used to require some college credits, but now it's just a high school diploma. CDC, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, I believe is also just a high school diploma. And they make really good money. But, you know, obviously the risks of the job come along with that. I'm skipping that. Professionalism is a problem. It has been a problem in law enforcement and corrections. Now, when you have people who have only a high school diploma and maybe haven't put that much hard work into getting that job, maybe they kind of take it for granted. But so the whole profession is trying to become more professional, for lack of a better description there, by offering incentives for education, meaning they would pay you if you have an education, pay you more, and they have some better quality training. All right, so we're still talking about jails and prisons. Prisoner rights, the hands-off doctrine. This was a time when the courts were not involved in the day-to-day operations of the prison system. So if I were in prison and I were being starved to death, I would have no opportunity to file a lawsuit, and basically I had no recourse. I was just screwed. Okay, so this was up until 1964. So when I ask you what the hands-off doctrine is, this was a time in the United States before 1964. Probably not going to ask you a year, but where prisoners basically had no rights. As soon as they were behind those doors, the prison was the ultimate decision maker. So it was pretty rough. They do now have due process rights. Blah, blah, blah. Prisoner rights, yes. Freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So again, being in prison, obviously you do lose some rights, but not all of them. You do have the right within reason to free speech and practice of your religion. Now, again, I say within reason. The issue is always going to be what impact could it have on the security of the prison. So if you got someone in prison screaming, you know, riot, 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 yeah, that's probably not going to fly. So again, a lot of this stuff, they have rights within reason. When we talk about a prison, we talk about a total institution, meaning every aspect of their life is addressed there. They never really have to leave. I like to call it like their own little island. They never have to leave there. They eat there, they sleep there, they poop there, they work there, they do everything there. Okay, so that's what a total institution is. I always, again, think of that as their own little island, not my island, their island. Institutionalization or prisonization is the whole process by which a person kind of just gets used to being in prison. A lot of time, and we all kind of know this, with change, we adjust. Even right now, we have been told, directed to stay home for 6 weeks now. We adjust accordingly. Prisoners do that too. When you end up in prison and you realize you're going to be there for 20 years, you adjust. And it's just part of life. So that whole institutionalization is when a person has taken on the lifestyle of being a prisoner. The inmates have their own subculture, as you can imagine. Things that are important to us might be different than what's important to an inmate. Maybe to us it's a fancy car or nice clothes or jewelry or whatever. When you're an inmate, all you have is respect. That's it. So you can imagine that respect is probably one of the most important things to them. It's just different. They live by a separate set of rules that are not written. It's called the Inmate Code, and it's not written anywhere, but they have their own way of living. Like, don't be friends with the cops, meaning the correctional officers. Don't snitch. Mind your own business. All that kind of stuff, part of the inmate subculture. I'm gonna kind of skip into that. Guess what? There's gangs in prison. I know, you're shocked. Yeah, why? Probably for protection. Honestly, the average person who goes into prison ends up joining a gang because of they need protection. And it can start little and grow into all kinds of stuff. Prison gangs are obviously a significant issue in California, and we in the Central Valley have specifically been really good about spreading the Bulldog Street Gang to other prisons. They were getting too strong in some of our Central Valley prisons, so we shipped them elsewhere, and then the Bulldogs grew and grew. They grew stronger because we shipped them all over the state into different prisons. So prison gangs, yes, we all know that they can still run the streets from a prison cell too. Gangs, security threat groups, gang affiliations are difficult to identify. Prison riots, as you can imagine, a bunch of men or women, but men living in a confined space under pretty miserable circumstances for years on end could be a perfect recipe for a disastrous prison riot. And I think that 1971 Attica prison riot was probably the worst that ever took place, and some prisoners and officers were killed. We actually had one in the United States, I want to say back east, maybe a year or two ago, and an officer was killed. Sexual assault happens in prison too. I know, you're shocked. Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's it. How do drugs get in? There's all kinds of interesting ways. Visitors, correctional personnel, vendors, pretty much you name it. Solitary confinement is also something that is used occasionally in the prison system, basically physically segregating inmates from each other. They can be punished and put into these types of solitary confinement situations, or that's, as this book would call it, punitive segregation. I would call it disciplinary. Is it disciplinary confinement? Anyways, punitive segregation, meaning a person is violent and their behavior is what's causing them to be held separately, or administrative detention or segregation, which is when a person is at risk of being harmed. And I use the example of Deputy Chief of the Fresno Police Department, Keith Foster. He is currently in prison, in federal prison. Because of who he is, he's a target for violence, so he is probably in administrative segregations. He's probably held separately for his own safety. So there's two reasons. You can be held in segregation because of your behavior or because of who you are. You're at risk of being injured. Solitary confinement has been changing a lot over the past few years, especially in the juvenile facilities. The correctional facilities are learning that this really does drive people insane and makes people do some really crazy stuff. Although there are some times when it's required, I don't believe solitary confinement right now is not something that's really looked upon in a good light. So, women in prison. Okay, women and men in prison behave very differently. Women form families when they get to prison, it's very bizarre. You will see it happen. I have seen it happen. The number of women in prison is growing. It's not anywhere near the number of men, but it is growing. And they definitely have different issues, because when you think of women in prison, typically they have children, and the children are usually living with a grandparent or in foster care, and that's a huge stressor for women that are in prison. Female inmates are also, because there are so few of them, there are not as many programs and services that are offered specifically to deal with women's issues. Blah, 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 personal relationships. They are less violent, but separation from their children and drug abuse are two of the really big issues that women face. They also have a lot of physical health issues and mental health issues. So women definitely have, they're definitely a very different environment working with women in prison than with men. And will say honestly, as a woman, I would a million times over rather work in a men's facility. Women are just very needy, and yeah, they're very hard to deal with. So anyways, maybe I just don't have patience. I don't know. But anyways, women also typically don't have any job skills. They've had a history of physical or sexual abuse, which led them to their criminal behavior. There's a lot more to it when a woman commits a criminal offense as opposed to when a man does. And women, unfortunately, sometimes are become involved in sexual relationships with staff, which is not a sexual relationship. That's called rape, because the staff member, a woman clearly does not have the ability to consent if she is a prisoner and the staff member is a staff member. So, yeah. Prison Rape Elimination Act. So this is a program which is kind of frustrating because it's not required, but it's a program that was put into place to protect victims of sexual assault in prison. Meaningful work. Oh, look, they're all raising dogs. Do you think it helps? Yeah, I think so. There are a lot of treatment programs for pretty much every need you could think of within the prison facilities. Drugs, sex offenders, violent offenders, mental health, you name it. Yeah, there's lots of programs. There are special need populations. If you can imagine, there's a lot of people that went to prison in their early 20s on their third strike, meaning they're going to spend the rest of their lives in prison. So aging inmates is a significant problem. They cost a lot more money because of healthcare costs and because they are at risk of victimization. And these guys are in prison. Yes, they are. Mentally disordered inmates. There's a lot of inmates with mental illness, as you can imagine. Again, lots of sex offenders, child molesters. I want to tell you the story of that one, but oh, God, there's a lot. Okay. So, civil commitments. If someone is deemed a sexually violent predator and they time out, they have served every last day of their confinement. Let's say it's a rapist and he was sentenced to 10 years for rape, and after the 10 years is over, he's still a sexually violent predator. There's something called a civil commitment that could keep him in custody longer. That's my short version of that. Physically disabled inmates, of course, you're going to have inmates without arms, blind, deaf, you name it. They're going to have them. Foreign-born inmates, people with chronic illnesses, AIDS, coronavirus. Well, coronavirus isn't really chronic, but HIV, AIDS, all that kind of stuff. How do you treat them? What do you do with your coronavirus patients? Do you separate them from everybody else? I don't know. Anyways, AIDS, HIV and AIDS has been a significant problem in correctional facilities because unfortunately there is typically sexual behaviors in the facility. And how does the correctional officer manage, oh, sorry, that wasn't correctional officer. When someone goes to prison, there's typically an entire family involved. Meaning somebody else, the whole family's life has changed, not just the inmate. Some states allow these conjugal visits where they're able to go and have sex with their spouses. That's awesome. That's it. All right, I was trying to whip through that. Oh, now I gotta stop.